A population boom, growth, and expansion. These are the hot topics we address on today's edition of Inside Leesburg, How We Grow. Hi everyone, and welcome to our first edition of Inside Leesburg, a show designed to take you inside the inner workings of our lakefront city. On today's episode, we're talking growth and development. You've probably noticed housing developments are popping up all over Lake County, but how is Leesburg handling that growth? And what's on the horizon for the lakefront city? Joining me today in the studio is Leesburg City Manager Al Minner to discuss how our city is handling this growth we're seeing in Lake County, specifically here in Leesburg. Thanks for joining us, Al.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. First, I want to talk about our population growth. According to census estimates, Leesburg's population is sitting around 31,000, and we are expected to grow to more than 33,000 by 2030. And with that population increase, obviously comes a demand for housing. How has our housing landscape changed in Leesburg to keep up with this population growth?
Really, I think the biggest part of our population change has been the villages. I don't think we have a lot of discussions. There's been a lot of talk of how many houses and PUDs, the city planned unit developments, that the city's approved, and I think that magic number is a little bit north of 40,000. But in actuality, most of the development has really been villages driven.
Interesting. Is overdevelopment a concern for the city, and are there any plans to entertain a development or annexation moratorium in the near future?
You know, I think that's a relative question. From my seat, I don't think growth is a major issue. I think it's an important issue. I think it's one we're tackling well and we've planned for. But I don't think that the growth issue is a cataclysmic issue, and I don't think that it's as significant as folks think. So with that regard, do I see a moratorium that the commission would do? No. Has the commission done a few things to kind of manage it? Yeah. A couple of the examples would be in our PUDs. We've kind of gone back to the old-fashioned way, and we're sunsetting the PUDs a little quicker. So what I mean by that, the typical entitlement that we would give when a PUD is approved would be for 8 years. We flirted with a couple of PUDs that went up to 10. And then as more and more PUDs came through, we started rolling those back. So essentially, in our PUD, we have language now that say you're going to expire, your entitlement is expired in 4 years. And then if that entitlement is expired, then it automatically reverts to a very strict zoning classification, which we call R1 estate. So it's a residential, so it's a pure 1 acre, 1 house residential development, and so that would be like the strictest residential zoning classification for a municipal corporation. So we're injecting those in now. So a strict deadline of expiration and a back to a specific zoning classification. Now developers are still being entitled to come back and reapply, but I think our process there is to force them to do that. A couple of the other things with the skylight, the shielding, the lighting, the trees in every yard, and different facades that we require in different areas and those type of things. So I think there's a bunch of different things that we have been injecting into the PUDs, not to put a moratorium on development, but to control it and make sure it's the quality development that Leesburg should get.
Right. I want to touch on what happens when a development is deemed improperly denied, like we saw with the Sunnyside PUD. In what situations can a development not be denied, and what happens when they are deemed improperly denied?
Katie, there's a lot in that question, so I want to digress a little bit. I think one of the things that Leesburg doesn't get enough credit for is how well we have managed our growth. You see developments popping up everywhere. The county's talked about ISBAs and JPAs, joint planning agreements, ISBAs, inter-service boundary agreements. And I honestly think Leesburg's been a leader in that. And I think unfairly, we've gotten the brunt of some of this Leesburg's out of control growth, really with no data or facts that support it. And I would point, and I'm not picking on other cities or the county for that matter, but numbers are numbers. And if you look at South County and you look at Groveland growth, they're outpacing us as far as and I'm going to delineate villages growth and private sector growth. And I think we got to talk about that a little bit in our conversation, because what residents I think are seeing is villages growth and defining that as private sector growth. So let's take a second and define that real quick in this answer. The Villages is a special market to Central Florida, and I will argue vehemently that development is needed for our Central Florida economy. We have lots of economic staples, and I think Florida's always struggled with an identification of what we do, what is our mainstay of economy. You know, so in that conversation, got to go back to World War II. And what was Florida back in World War II? It was an agrarian. It was an agrarian culture. Cattle, citrus. In the 60s and 70s, we started changing. We flirted with trying to be aerospace or different widget type of manufacturers. But at the end of the day, Florida has always fallen back to when we're building homes and people moving into Florida, that's what we are. We're tourist based with Disney in South Florida, and we're retirement based. And you see more and more our agrarian roots going away, citrus and cattle moving out. So what's special about now the Villages is they have been a mainstay since the 2000s. Okay, and what they've done is brought in a high quality development that employs that service economy that our Central Florida really relies on. And what's different about the Villages product is it's geared for a specific market. They say they're going to build it and they develop it. Now, how does that compare to private sector development? So will you see other communities, kind of the urban growth spreading from Orlando, and how Lake County's dealt with it, Claremont, Groveland, Mineola, you see them go through a similar process that we do. They come in through an annexation process, they do their PUDs, zone it, develop it. And typically now what the private sector is going to do is they go out, they buy major chunks of land, they get entitlements on that property, and they either flip it, meaning sell it again, or they develop it. And so what Leesburg has seen, aside from the Villages, which is the driver of the numbers that you opened the show with, the Villages has driven those growth numbers in Leesburg. So I think 10 years ago when I started in Leesburg, we were 26,000 people, and now we're 33. Mind you, 6,000 of that is last year. That is Villages growth. But on the private sector, what we see is we have seen multiple developers come in, NVR Homes, KB Homes, Adams Homes. I mean, rattle off the big national home developer. They come in, they put options on big tracts of land, and then they seek their entitlements. And so that's the process that our folks are seeing. Now, having said that, I'd be remiss to say that little subdivisions haven't popped up here and there. And if you cut away the Villages numbers from our number, what you see really is a steady 3 to 5% growth rate in Leesburg. The Villages has inflated that. And so with the 40,000 units on the books that we have, 14,850 are actually village entitlements. The rest of them are what I call private sector entitlements. And so another great number I got to throw at you is during the Villages development of the 470 property, the Villages probably cleared somewhere around 275 units a month. So clearing means they were issued a CO and somebody was able to move into that home. It's sold. Mm-hmm. And so that's really the measure, in my opinion, of growth is what is that community, what's that political subdivision, what's that municipal corporation doing as far as single family COs issued per month. So when the Villages was moving along, the Villages was issuing 275 to 300 units a month, right? So that's a crazy big number. So that's, crazy big number. What Leesburg is doing is 30 units a month. And we've sustained that for several years now. We continue to hang in, so we bounce around 25 to 40 units a month, and we've been doing that probably for the last 3 years, with the exception of Lake Denham Estates. And I think that I want to say that was probably about 2019 timeframe where we actually saw like 75, 80, 85. But as soon as Lake Denham Estates was built out, we've fallen back into about 30 units a month. And you can pinpoint them around the community. Lake Denham Estates was a big one. Clear Springs is another one. Kind of the subdivision that kind of started off all these PUDs building up in Leesburg was what we called Mackleya. And just as another side note, so in planning and zoning talk, when you talk to Dan Miller later, when it comes at a staff level to the commission on planning and zoning board, we always call it by the name of the property owner, right, versus the subdivision it turns into. So you'll hear staff call it the old name, and then so Mackleya was kind of the granddaddy that kicked off all the disturbance about all this Leesburg development, which is now Eagle Trace or Eagle Tail. And so that subdivision moving. Up in the north side of our 44 quarter, you see the Roebuck Ostrander now starting to build houses, which is now Silver Lake Estates. The old golf course was one of the subdivisions we did years ago. It's now just starting to move, probably 5 or 6 years after the original PUD. So if you break down into our PUDs that have been approved and built, you see a ratio that's far less impressive than the worrisome number of 40,000. I don't know if I got all, or I don't know if I caught all your questions in that. But before we run out of time, the biggest, I think, the most important thing you asked in there is, what's the difference between an approved subdivision and one that one gets litigated, like on the Sunnyside subdivision? And I think this is really where the rubber hits the road. And I might be long-winded on this, but this is a really important answer, because I think sometimes the public has this expectation that the commission doesn't listen, and that's just not the case. When it comes to planning and zoning issues, it's regulated by state law, and for the common homeowner like me and you, the law, and if you don't want to see significant growth, nobody ever says we don't want to see any growth, but they want to say we want to see smart growth. Well, I'm here to tell you we do have smart growth, but the hitch in that is the law is not written in the favor of the normal, the average family homeowner or single family homeowner. It's written in favor of the developers, and it's written in favor of the large landowners. I mean, we're all capitalists, and it goes back to our revolutionary beginnings. It really does. And those who own the land have significant control. And that's section 163 of the Florida statutes. So whenever you go to a public meeting, whether it's a planning and zoning meeting or it's a commission meeting, and we move into a topic called a quasi-judicial hearing, that means the commission doesn't have a legislative prerogative to do what they want to do. Right? When we do the budget, we can say, we want that police car, we want that gymnasium, we need to fix that street, or no to those things. And they don't have to have a rhyme or reason. It's a majority rules. And that's a legislative prerogative of an elected body. And most of the times, they work in that fashion. But the law says, 163 says, when you come to a community and you have a land issue, that landowner has an entitlement. And so if you respond back to them and say, well, you got to put in a wider road, you got to do stuff for drainage, you got to do different things to mitigate a problem that you're causing on other people's action, the commission's answer to that question can't be just no. No, we don't like it because you're going to put more cars on the road. That is not a legal answer. So when commissions are in that quasi-judicial form, they have to answer on fact. What does the law say? How does that developer get to mitigate that? And if a developer comes back and they say, okay, well, we're going to put in that turn lane, then the commission can't say no. So what happened in Sunnyside, and this is where back to Leesburg doesn't get enough credit for what we've done to try to control growth, is, you know, I think we got incorrectly pegged as this unbridled growth community because of the amount of PUDs, because of our location on 27 and the road networks. Leesburg's always been that kind of hub community where traffic's come in and out of us. So it's no different now. So these private companies are looking for these areas to grow up these corridors that are in Leesburg's ISBA. So what happened on the Sunnyside situation was we said no. The owner of that property, or who had it under contract, filed suit against the city because they offered mitigatory strategies pursuant to 163 that they thought prevented us from saying no. So when we went to litigate that, we lost. And the special magistrate found that indeed they offered the proper mitigatory strategies. Indeed, they were within our comprehensive plan. And indeed, that developer had a right for those entitlements, and the city commission couldn't stop them. So as much as folks come to the commission and say, you can't do this, you're not watching after us, you don't care what we think, we do. And the reason that more times than not, the residents don't get the answer of no growth that they want is because elected officials' hands are tied, and they're tied to the law.
Right. As part of the series, we've asked our viewers to send in some questions on the topic of growth in Leesburg. As you can imagine, we had a pretty decent response.
I can imagine.
One of the common themes was South Leesburg. You touched on this a little bit, but we've seen a lot of growth in South Leesburg, which has been a particular sticking point for some residents. Many have come to commission meetings and expressed their displeasure as the area grows more and more and is annexed into the city. Can you explain why Leesburg entertains annexing non-contiguous land into the city and what challenges that brings?
Well, first I'm going to argue that many of our annexations are not uncontiguous. And so where did the non-contiguous annexation come from? Because again, 163 says a municipal corporation, which is the legal word for a city, has to annex in a fashion that's contiguous and next to certain parcels. There's an exception in the law that says if a city, a municipal corporation, has an agreement with their county, the political subdivision, then they can formulate their own rules. And so what happened in Lake County in about 2003 is there was kind of the first rumblings of growth, and the county as well as the cities got together and we created this ISBA, Inter-Service Boundary Agreement. And that agreement was basically the cities were concerned about managing the growth as far as what each subdivision is going to look like, where the roads are going to be, who's going to provide for water and sewer. And the county was concerned about fire services because counties have an issue, and Lake County is a special county because it has a mix of urban and rural growth in it, right? It doesn't look like Dade County or counties in Florida that are where you go from unincorporated areas to incorporated areas, and they're seamless. So Lake's in this transition of urban to rural to urban, and what's that going to look like? So the county was concerned about that. So we put together agreements that boxed out areas of where municipal corporations would grow. In exchange for boxing out these areas, the county said, okay, you guys, the municipal corporations you can grow anywhere you need to in this box because that's the natural growth development, but you have to provide the municipal services. Municipal services, primarily the county's major concern was fire protection, because that's a tough one for counties, because if counties are urban, then fire protection for urban areas looks like a municipal corporation for us. If counties have this mix of rural and urban, then those fire services become hard for them to manage. So their concern was, okay, cities, you guys manage your box, but you also have to manage the urban services. So that's what the 2013 agreement looked like. And I can't remember how many cities, 5 or 6 joined: Leesburg, Claremont, Groveland, Mascot, Mineola. I think Tavares might have been in there. Don't hold me to all those, but I think I'm pretty close. So that went along. Leesburg then in 2014 took the next step. And the next step in 2014 was we had identified specific areas where we could grow or not grow in the ISBA in 2013 ISBA agreement. And then in the 2014 agreement, we just said, let's just give us our box to manage, and we will guarantee fire services in this area if you give us the annexation rule of we could annex anywhere in our box. And the county approved that. So now apply all of that to your question. And even with the non-annexation rule, I would still argue that in South Leesburg, our annexations, or PUDs, have been compact and contiguous to urban development. So when you go down 27, you've got Lake Denham Estates. You've got a couple of other developments. You pass 33 and you get into Royal Highlands. And then you get to 48, you get to 48, you get into Legacy and Arlington Ridge, kind of early developments in Leesburg. But then those two developments are up against Highland Lakes and Plantation. And Plantation is 5,000 units. So it's the biggest unincorporated urban area in the county. So when you take Leesburg Incorporated next to unincorporated urban areas on both sides of US 27, and then you annex those areas, Whispering Hills, Hodges, Barkey, Leiden Nichols, all those developments to the south, you've got compact and contiguous growth. Mm-hmm. So I know folks don't see that, but Leesburg is really, I think, planned out its development in a way that we know we can provide the water and sewer infrastructure. That side of the city's outside our electric service territory. We know we can provide it growth. And different than other communities in the county, those primary access points on the south are connected to US 27. So that's a main arterial road. So we still have road networks. I know that kind of begs the question of, well, we see all this traffic in Leesburg, but you got to go back to where we are and why we see that traffic. Again, we're a transportation corridor. 27, 441 are major arterials through the state. It has major traffic coming up from South County, from Orlando, from other areas that come through our community. We hear constantly the complaints about the intersection of 33, 470, and 48, mm-hmm. right? That Okahumpka intersection. Yep. I would argue that's not Leesburg traffic. That's South County traffic. That's the the county, and again, not disrespecting the county, because growth is important for our economy. So I'm going to argue that the truck traffic that you see on those counties, that's the Fort Commerce Feed Park coming up to get to the turnpike. Mm-hmm. So and if you look at our traffic studies on the major arterials, the state roads in our community, 27, 44, and 441, there's only two failing areas. And they've been failing for a long time. And that's the intersection of 441 between Newell Hill and Perkins. And that's US 27 on the south side, right there at Singletary Park. I mean, to that degree, I think it was back in the 90s where FDOT created a 27 bypass to fix 27 and the Dixie interchange. Mm-hmm. So that those are probably the three areas that have been failing forever. Now the growth doesn't help it, but the growth that's on the books hasn't caused it. Mm-hmm. So these are things that we deal with. I think we've done a good job with it. I think that, if there's a problem, if you're going to put it in that message, if there's a problem, the problem is people want to move to Florida. Florida is a great place to live. And so those are the things that we manage every day.
Right. We also had a few questions about our natural resources. There has been a lot of concern about development's effects on the environment, and there has been some outcry as the county has entertained developments proposed for the Emeralda Marsh Rural Protection Area. We also received a question about our watersheds. How does the city work to factor in environmental protection when considering developments?
Those are really reasonable questions, and environmental concerns are always an issue. But I don't think there's any place in the United States that watches natural resources like we do in the state of Florida. And in that case, we use the other agencies like St. John's on water issues, whether what we're extracting from the aquifer for water consumption. We use the Water Management District as well for stormwater issues and protection issues. And we have DEP that manages takes of wildlife, whether it's gopher tortoises or protected species. Part of the conflict, I think, really becomes, and this is kind of a harder statement, is are the county rural protection zones really protecting rural area? Or are they protecting areas that we don't want growth? And I'll give you a classic example. The RPZ, the Ulaha Apopka RPZ on South 27, I would argue that that is not protecting protected areas. And if you go to the University of Florida maps and you look at these areas and you look for the endangered species that we're watching for, like the bobcats and the hawks and the eagles, you don't find those in the Ulaha Apopka RPZ. The Esmeralda Island RPZ, that's another story. That's a swampy area that does have these native wildlife inhabitants that we do need to protect. And I would argue with you that Leesburg really hasn't entered the Esmeralda RPZ but for Orange Bend, and we did that with the county's approval. So I would argue that the county and the city is actually working well together. I think we have state regulations and other growth regulations that protect those resources. And it just becomes a difficult question because growth is just a difficult conversation to have.
Right. We also got quite a few questions about how our dollars are being used. When a new development goes in, the city benefits from it in terms of impact fees and a growing tax base. And in some cases, developers are also required to provide some infrastructure changes. But one citizen wants to know what happens down the road. Have Leesburg officials done the math to calculate the long-term infrastructure costs of growth?
So the answer is yes. And the next statement would be the city's not annexing properties and doing development to make money. Okay, we're not in the money business. We are in the spend money business, wisely business, but we don't look at annexations as this is a way for the city to make money. We did look at the villages annexation as a way to spur the economy, which was on the heels of the recession when we did that. And there is ways that the economy is driven by growth. And we've talked about that. The growth is important for our service economy. So I'm not getting out of that statement, but what I'm trying to delineate between is the city doesn't look at annexation as a profit margin. We look at it as when growth comes in, can it pay for itself without taxing the existing taxpayers or users on our so we don't want growth to come in and tax us in our general services, roads, emergency services, and we don't want development to come in and use existing ratepayers to pay for sewer, water, or electric development. And so yeah, we do the calculus on that. One of the big things I think we'll probably be looking at in the new year is probably having to increase our impact fees. And the impact fees is the example of the single one thing that we charge developers to do so that when they develop their subdivisions or developments, it doesn't kick back and cost the existing users more money.
Al, thank you for sitting down and chatting with us about the growth in Leesburg.
My pleasure.
Next, we are sitting down with Planning and Zoning Director Dan Miller to get his perspective on the explosion of growth in our lakefront city. Hi, I'm Katie Sartoris, and you're watching Inside Leesburg, How We Grow Edition. You don't need me to tell you that Lake County, Florida is experiencing a population boom. The question is, how is our city facilitating all this growth and expansion? Well, we couldn't think of a better person to sit down with than the director of the City of Leesburg's Planning and Zoning Department, Dan Miller. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
Thanks, Katie. Glad to be here.
We spoke to Al a bit about the development process when it gets to the commission, but I wanted to talk to you about the planning department and what it does before it gets there. I want to impress upon our viewers that much of the development process is dictated at a state level, and Al spoke on that a little bit. How do state laws and regulations play into the local development process?
Okay, well, Katie, state law has a great deal of impact on the development process. Al may have spoken about Chapter 163, which is in the Florida statutes. Chapter 163 requires a comprehensive plan for every city and county in Florida. Now, a comprehensive plan is basically a blueprint of the future of a city, its growth, its development, how you're going to handle those types of things. It's divided up into elements, or which are simply chapters: water, wastewater, housing, recreation, drainage, things of that nature. All development has to be consistent with that comprehensive plan for each city. In addition to that, the state has a number of agencies such as the Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Transportation, Florida Commerce and Education, and so on. And all of those agencies get to take a look and a review at new developments. So there's a ton of coordination and activity that goes on behind the scenes. Really what you see at a zoning hearing or a plan review is sort of the tip of the iceberg. But the state overall has a huge impact on local development.
Many of the developments that we see going up around the area are planned unit developments, which is a special land use designation that allows for some flexibility to create things like neighborhoods with amenities. Tell me about the development process for a planned unit development.
A planned unit development is a form of zoning that's customizable. In other words, we can put in restrictions or requirements into the zoning conditions. For example, if a new neighborhood wants to come in, we're going to put in some requirements for a playground or additional retention, and we can help require the different lot sizes and setbacks, things of that nature. You can put a lot of different things in a planned unit development. So overall, though, a PUD is simply a zoning district, and it will go through the exact same process that you would find on any zoning request. For example, a typical zoning request starts off with an inquiry by a developer to the staff, to my office. We'll sit down and have a pre-application meeting. We'll talk to them about what they want to do, how does it fit in with what's around the area, how does it work with our comp plan and our land development regulations. It will then become, if they choose to move forward, it will then become an application. That application could be for rezoning, comprehensive plan, annexation, conditional use permit, variance. It could be a number of different types of applications and permits. From there, the staff will take it, review it, and write a recommendation. That recommendation is strictly based on the comp plan and our land development regulations. It's not based on does the staff like a proposed development or not. There's some confusion about that. We don't always like the ones we see, but we have a job to do to ensure that it's consistent with the comp plan and land development regulations. From there it goes to the Planning Commission, where that's a citizen-appointed board. There are 7 members, and they review it based on the staff's recommendation and the information presented. They'll make another recommendation. From that point, it then goes for 2 city commission hearings. The first one is a reading, simply reading it into the record as an announcement to the public that we're having this decision coming up. From there, it goes to the second reading, and that's usually where the most discussion takes place. A presentation can be made by staff, by the applicant. Questions are asked by the commission. The public gets a chance to speak. At any of these public hearings, the public gets a chance to speak. And from there, the City Commission will make a final decision as to approve or disapprove.
Right. In what ways can residents get involved with this process?
Residents, we're always glad to see people show up at these meetings. Some of these meetings have literally 1 or 2 people, and it's applicants. Some of them have a packed full house, depending on how controversial the subject is. But the way to get involved, you can always call our office and ask for information. We'll sit down with you. If you make an appointment, we'll sit down and talk to you about these developments. You can come to the public hearings and record your views. Contrary to popular belief, the staff, the Planning Commission, and the City Commission are listening. We do have to be consistent with our comp plan and land development regulations in Chapter 163, but we take into account what the public is saying, and it often has an impact on what those final conditions are in a zoning. One of the most important ways, I feel, is given the way we have a democracy, you need to get out and vote. If you have the laws leaning to one side or the other, whether that's left or right, I don't want to get into that, but if the laws for a long time lean to the left or to the right, sometimes there needs to be a change so that that pendulum swings back to the center or swings back the other way. And that's the way it is in Florida. They've kind of swung toward the development community. Nothing against the development community, but they've swung toward the development community for a long time. And people need to get out, particularly and vote for their state representatives and let them know.
Yeah.
And that's a particular thing that I would like to stress is get out there and vote.
Yeah, absolutely. As part of the series, we have asked some of our residents to send in questions, and for this one, we've asked them to send in questions on the topic of growth in Leesburg. The first question is about infill, existing land that could be developed. What percentage of Leesburg's future development will come from urban infill? And does Leesburg have an existing program that addresses the underutilized parcels?
Okay. I don't really have an exact percentage, Katie, of what comes from infill right now. The majority of what we're getting at this point is not strictly infill as in downtown. It's a little more out in the suburban areas with some, well, for example, the Villages is the major growth point right now. But we do anticipate that infill will take a larger and larger portion over time of the development that occurs in Leesburg. As planners, we really like to see infill because it's a reuse of structures, it's a reuse of land, it's a change. Sometimes it's not a change, it's just simply an upgrade. But reuse is loved because it doesn't really create additional trips. It's simply reusing the existing buildings and land that's there. In terms of incentives and things that are going on, we do utilize an impact fee waiver that we've had in place for several years. That has to do with buildings that have been abandoned or unused for a certain amount of time. It's either 6 months or a year, depending on the situation. And that impact fees, as you know, water, wastewater, police, fire, transportation, education, those types of things are very expensive. And they're caused when there's an impact on a new impact on the system. With reuse, you generally don't have a new impact. But if you change that use and increase the intensity, there is some. So we want to waive those impact fees on these structures that are being reused to encourage their redevelopment. We're also are doing a lot of different things in terms of, for example, the expansion of the central business district downtown. We have a downtown mixed-use future land use category. What we're taking with that is expanding that out of downtown, covering the Lee School, going back toward the trail, and then moving back out south towards Dixie. That's going to allow more uses than what's currently allowed. And that's an incentive for people to come in and put in new housing, things of that nature. One example of that is, as everyone knows, the Lee School was approximately 100 years old. It had been sitting there for well over a decade with no real interest or use. It eventually was demolished, and there's a plan for some potential apartments to go there. So that's a reuse of that land. It's changing the use from the school use to a residential use. We anticipate that to begin happening sometime next year. Still got to go through another rezoning and some more of the bureaucratic process that's normal for rezoning. But we also have some work going on within that downtown mixed-use area that we're planning for along the trail, along the south side of the trail. There'll be some residential units there, so your front porch, so to speak, small front porch, would front the trail, and you'd come in, park in the back. These are some really excellent reuse ideas that will enhance the downtown area, bring people downtown, make downtown more walkable. If you live at Lee School or along the trail in one of the new townhouse units that we're hoping to get in soon, you can walk to restaurants, you can walk to entertainment, you can walk to shopping. That will encourage more of that. So there's a big economic growth benefit for these reuse projects. And like I said, as planners, we love to see those. So I think in the future, the reuse component, or the component that will be infill development, is going to increase by a significant amount.
Interesting, very interesting. We also had a question about commercial development.
Mm-hmm.
Why does the city keep approving so many of the same commercial uses, like car washes and Dollar Generals, when we already have so many in and around our city?
If I had $1 for every car wash and $1 for every Dollar General, I'd be retired.
Yeah.
This gets back to the free market. Okay. We do have plenty of car washes. We have plenty of dollar stores. But the people who own the property have property rights. And if they choose to enter the market, enter the free market, and compete at the car wash use or the dollar store use, they're free to do that. They're free to go in and succeed, and they're free to go in and fail. So in the capitalistic system that we have, the strong survive. And with the population growth, we would hope the population growth over time, it's going to take some time for the population to grow, but I would like to think that all of these businesses will succeed. That's unlikely, let's be honest. So that again will come to a point of reuse. We had a situation of a bread store down on 27. I forget what it was prior to that, but it became like a day-old bread store. Then it was abandoned for several years. Then it was demolished and turned into a car wash. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the owner of that property may say, I want to sell, I've had enough of being in the car wash business, and it could turn into another use. That's an infill project that we could see, and that's just one example, but there are plenty of them out there. I really identify with this question because there's a dollar store on every corner. There's a car wash on every corner. But the free market dictates, and as a government, we don't think we should be telling the citizens, getting into that level of you can only have so many car washes or so many dollar stores. Mm-hmm. That's really a market decision.
Mm-hmm. Right. Lastly, a citizen had a question about landscape requirements. Mm-hmm. Can we make landscape requirements for residential and commercial developers stricter, especially after it's all been approved and everything dies and there is no upkeep?
We can and we will. This is one that's close to our hearts here because we see this. We go and work very hard. We get landscape plans on these new developments. We review them, they come in, they meet the code. They're good for about a year. And then the owners of the property don't properly take care of them, don't fertilize, don't water, don't do that. Right now, the city is working on revising its comprehensive plan. Once that is completed, we will move into changing our land development regulations. Every time you update your comp plan, which is about every 10 years, you have about 18 months, according to state law, to go in and revise your land development regulations, because your land development regulations, i.e. the zoning code, things of that nature, are what implement the comp plan. So we are very intent on doing exactly that in our next round of land development code changes, which again we'll anticipate starting those in early 2025. actually done some scratch outs, some planning on those, scratching out the existing pages and trying to bring in some better regulations, not more regulation, that's not the point, but better regulations to the point of the question. One of the areas we'll work on in there is a longer period of required maintenance. Then we can work with our code enforcement group, which is in the police department, to keep those regulations adhered to. So that's a question that we have been having internal discussions on within the planning and zoning department.
All right, Dan, one more question before we go. Can you tell me about the development review process and how each city department plays a part in it?
Sure. Hopefully you have some time. Developments, depending on the type of development, have a very extensive review process called the development review process, and it's run by the Public Works Department, by the DRC, Development Review Committee. The DRC is a committee that consists of one person from each department in the city. They are assigned to take an application for development and review that based on their part of the code and what they do. For example, zoning will look at it from a zoning standpoint, building will look at it from a building standpoint, police, fire, Public Works looks at it from water, wastewater, retention, and so forth. So each city department is going to take and look at that application and say, what's the impact on the water lines? What size of water lines do we need here? Have they engineered that properly to be large enough to have the correct angle so that the water flows? And are there any pumps needed to pump the water up or pump the wastewater out? Those kind of things. It's very, very extensive and can take a considerable amount of time. It starts off with a pre-application process. Again, we do a lot of pre-application meetings so that we know what's coming in so we can smooth out the development review process. And then an engineer or an architect is required to come up with the plans and submit those. Those plans will have on it basically the horizontal development. The development review process is really more or less about the horizontal level. The building plans, or the vertical when you build the building up, and we're talking about the horizontal review. The infrastructure, the placement of the building, the lighting, the landscaping, the engineering that goes along with the drainage and water and wastewater, those kind of things. So that set of plans comes in. For a small development, it might be 5-10 pages. For a larger development, you could have 100 pages in one submittal. We're also doing that electronically now as well. Some of the smaller ones we'll still do on paper, I think, but basically it's all done electronically, and everyone's got larger screens now to make it easier to review. But it comes into the Public Works Department. They assign it a number. It gets loaded into the specific software that shoots it out to all the different departments. Then you have a specific amount of time, 2-3 weeks, whatever it is running at the particular time, to review your portion of the code. So the guys in the water department, the folks in the wastewater department, police, fire, they're all looking at it from their perspective. The fire department has fire codes, the building department has the building codes, planning has the land development regulations, and so on down the line. What we're looking for is to see that the proposal, which has already been through, at this point, if the zoning was needed or an annexation or comp plan, it's already been through that stage. So what we're looking for now is to be consistent with the city's codes and the state building codes. In terms of drainage, there are requirements for 24, 48, 72-hour storm events, rain events, we might call them. On the zoning, does it meet the PUD zoning if it's a PUD, or does it meet the specific zoning category of what that land is? So it goes through that process. Each department provides comments back to Public Works. Public Works then takes it to the engineer. The engineer changes and resubmits, makes those comments, corrections, and resubmits. The process starts again. It's in Leesburg, I would say we have a pretty effective process compared to a lot of places, in all honesty. So we're always working to improve and cut the time out. So a big part of that is how quickly the engineer or architect can respond to the city's comments versus how long we have to review it. So, and it just, in a market like this today, everyone is busy. All the engineers, the architects, the surveyors, and the cities, we're all loaded with work. So we're getting through it as quickly as we can. But I think Leesburg does a real good job with it.
Yeah.
So.
Good. Dan, thank you so much for sitting down and talking with us today about growth.
Thank you, Katie. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Inside Leesburg. We encourage you to attend your local government meetings. They are open to the public. Planning Commission meetings are usually held the third Thursday of the month at 4:30 p.m. on the third floor at Leesburg City Hall. Leesburg Commission meetings are held the second and fourth Mondays of each month at 5:30 p.m. You can find the entire meeting schedule and agendas at leesburgflorida.gov. Until next time, I'm Katie Sartoris. Get outdoors and enjoy this beautiful place we all call home.